Chapter 1. The Call and the Road to the Mountain. The Burden of Faith and the Desert of Temptation. The sands of Sinai blazed under the merciless sun, which hung over the world like the eye of an unforgiving judge. The wind, carrying not coolness, but only fine, scorching dust, whispered ancient secrets, yet its whisper was dull and incomprehensible. Moses walked among the people, and every step he took was not merely a physical displacement, but a measure of his own solitude. He felt the earth trembling beneath his feet, but this was not geological fear. It was a sacred tremor, as if the very ground was listening to the inevitable voice of God. His heart burned with an anxiety heavier than all his prophetic duties, and simultaneously with an unwavering faith, which was his only support in this boundless desert. He knew the time had come to receive that which would change the destiny of the Israelites, not just on this land, but in the very essence of their existence. It was the time of the law, which was to transform a crowd of former slaves into a chosen people. The people of Israel, though liberated from Egyptian bondage, remained psychologically unfree. Their souls, like their sandals, were covered in dust and fatigue. They followed Moses not with steadfast faith, but with a sharp, constant need for a miracle, for palpable proof. Their memory of the manna from heaven was as short as a noonday shadow, and their complaints about thirst and hunger sounded louder than the praise of the Lord. Moses heard their murmurs, which permeated the ranks like poison, and this caused him greater pain than the pressure of the crowd. Every look of dissatisfaction, every whisper of doubt, was a blow to his own faith. He was not just a leader, but a bridge between heaven and earth, and he felt this bridge was constantly being threatened from both sides. As they approached the foot of Sinai, a mountain that erupted from the flat land like a finger pointing to heaven, the atmosphere shifted. Even the most hardened skeptics shuddered. The mountain was shrouded in a thick black smoke that rose like from a giant furnace, and from time to time it was engulfed in blinding crimson flame. This was a wild, primal phenomenon that testified to the fact that here, on this stone, the earthly meets the celestial. Moses established a sacred boundary, drawing an invisible but insurmountable line around the mountain that separated the human world from the realm of the absolute. He warned the people, "Do not approach, do not touch. Even the livestock that touches the mountain must be stoned." This was the very first lesson of the law. There is a space where man must realize his insignificance before the majesty of the Creator. At that moment, Moses took one last look at his people. He saw thousands of faces mixed with fear, curiosity, and impatience. He knew he was going to plead for their freedom, but not freedom from labor or suffering, but freedom from the slavery of their own hearts. He felt the weight of all the past and future settling upon his shoulders, and his last breath on the plain was filled with the dust of the desert, and a silent prayer that his strength would suffice for this epical encounter. He was ready. He felt his human flesh becoming a fiber between two worlds, and he knew that, having ascended the mountain, he would forever cease to be a simple man, becoming a solemn shadow of prophetic duty. Chapter 2. On Mount Sinai, the acoustics of eternity and the human limit. The shadows on the summit were dense and impenetrable, saturated with invisible energy. When Moses was commanded to ascend the peak, he felt he was taking a step not upwards, but into another dimension. He left behind the last faint echoes of voices and campfires, stepping into the realm of thundering silence. His heart pounded in rhythm with the echoes of thunder that sliced through the dense, electrified air. This was the rhythm of the divine heart, which was terrifying and alluring at once. Lightning illuminated the prophet's face, snatching him from the darkness for just a moment, only to cast him back into the unknown. The ascent was a confession in stone. Every step brought him closer to the mysterious presence of God, and at the same time moved him further from his own earthly nature. He climbed, passing through zones where the air was hot, as if in a forge, and then cold, as if in an ice cave, and he understood that these were energy thresholds that no other person could withstand. The stones beneath his feet were seared with heat, but he felt no pain, for his consciousness was already beyond physical sensation. The summit was enveloped in the cloud of glory, a dense, layered covering that was not just fog, but the very substance of presence. It was a mixture of darkness and light that pulsed deep within. In this cloud, there was no visibility, but there was an all-encompassing sense of being. Moses entered it, and it was like plunging into the ocean of eternity. Time and space lost their meaning. There, in the very depth of the cloud, the voice resonated. It was not a voice in the usual sense, but the acoustics of eternity, penetrating every fiber of his being. It was a combination of the sound of a trumpet that grew ever louder, incomparable to any human instrument, and thunder, which was not the sound of a weather phenomenon, but the affirmation of the absolute. Moses remained there for 40 days and 40 nights. This was not a time for sleep or food. It was a period of transformation. His body was nourished not by bread, but by the Word. His thirst was quenched not by water, but by the presence. His consciousness was stretched to the limit, accepting divine information so intense that it could shatter a normal human mind. He stood alone as the sole witness, and his solitude was terrible and beautiful simultaneously. He did not see the face of God, but felt his essence passing by. A wind that was incomparably pure, a fire that did not burn but consumed all human impurities. He was the mediator who had to translate the incomprehensible divine will into clear, understandable human rules. Moses felt the immense pressure of this mission. He was to become the translator of heaven and his heart, the converter of energy. He was at his limit, but his will was firm as the rock of Sinai, for he knew that his people, trembling below, needed this law to avoid perishing in the chaos of their own imperfection. Chapter 3. The Ten Commandments. The fiery code of freedom. The silence on the summit was dynamic, filled with the hum of energy. Then, in the very depth of this absolute silence, the epic event of writing began. On the stone tablets, which were already in Moses' hands, a bright, unearthly fire flared up. This was not a flame that consumes. It was writing by light. Moses felt the touch of the Almighty, penetrating not only his skin, but also his bones, reaching his very soul. Every word carved onto the tablets was heavy and sacred, as if the very truth of the universe was compressed into the form of a letter. This was not human carving. It was the calligraphy of the divine will, and the stone received these words with such ease, as if they were natural to it. The tablets became a concentrate of the cosmos, the first part addressing the vertical relationship between man and the Creator was filled with absolute, uncompromising purity. "I am the Lord your God," the voice resonated, and this was the laying of the first, most important stone in the foundation of their national consciousness. To have no other gods was not a prohibition. It was a proclamation of freedom from all idols, from the slavery of foreign cults, from the fear of the elements. You shall not make for yourself a carved image was a ban on limiting God, on imprisoning him in material form. Moses held these two worlds in stone. He felt the metaphysical weight of these words. Freedom begins with one God. The sacred time of the Sabbath is liberation from the tyranny of time and labor. The name of the Lord is not just a sound, but a guarantee that should not be used lightly. The second part, addressing the horizontal relationship between man and neighbor, was the foundation of human civilization. Moses knew this was guidance for the souls of the people standing in the darkness of sins and temptations. Here were no philosophical musings, but only concrete, surgically precise instructions. Honor your father and your mother. This is a call for stability of the lineage, for respect for the past. You shall not murder. This is the inviolability of human life, the highest value next to God himself. You shall not commit adultery. This is the sanctity of marriage, the basis of society. You shall not steal. This is respect for the property and labor of another. You shall not bear false witness. This is the importance of truth, without which trust collapses. You shall not covet. This is a psychological law that goes to the very root of sin, stopping it before the act. Each commandment was not only a prohibitive boundary, but also a promise of a dignified, free life. Moses, standing on the mountain, realized that these words were not just rules, but a structural code intended to transform the disorganized chaos of former slaves into a harmonious state under divine rule. He held the greatest treasure in his hands, and his soul was filled with the ecstatic certainty that his people now had everything for salvation. Chapter 4. The Plea for Signs. A moment of frailty and revelation, Moses, after spending 40 days in the presence of unbearable perfection, began to feel the weight of human doubt seeping through the cracks of his prophetic consciousness. He was seized by deep anxiety for the people left below. He saw the tablets, and they were perfect, but he knew the people, whose memory lasted only until yesterday, would not believe in a word they had not seen. They needed a warm, visible, comforting proof, not just thunder and stone. He stretched out his hands to the heavens, although he was practically in the heart of the cloud. His plea was not a demand, but the cry of a weary leader. Lord, show us your glory. Give us signs of your presence, so that we may know we are not alone. Give me something I can show these blind, hardened hearts, lest they return to their idols. This was the moment of his greatest human frailty, and at the same time highest courage, for he dared to ask for what no living creature could endure. In response, Moses was not filled with a sense of calm. On the contrary, the lightning, which had only illuminated his face from the outside until now, suddenly illuminated him from within. The earth, or rather the rock beneath him, shuddered with a mighty force that flowed through the air, the earth, and the heart of man. This was not punishment, but a direct, all-consuming revelation that his request was too great. The voice that resonated in the cloud was gentle, yet so saturated with energy that Moses felt his flesh cracking. You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. But behold, there is a place by me, and you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by." This was an immediate, severe answer to his plea for mercy. God did not give him simple signs. He gave him the revelation of his essence, but only to the extent that human flesh could withstand it. Moses was hidden in the fissure, his eyes covered by the divine hand, and he felt an incomprehensible torrent of eternity passing by him. This was invisible, yet all-encompassing sense of mercy, goodness, patience, and wrath. The glory of God's name. When the torrent passed, and Moses was able to lift his head, he saw only the back of the glory, a reflection that was already almost unbearable. This was his deepest, most personal communion with the Creator, which he received not because of his righteousness, but because of the depth of his anxiety for his people. He understood that his mission was not to give the people visible signs, but to carry this invisible essence within himself and transform it into life. Now he had to descend, knowing that he carried not just the law, but the weight of the revelation itself. Chapter 5. The falling tablets, the sound of betrayal, and the bloody wrath. Descending from the summit, Moses and his faithful assistant, Joshua, who was waiting below, felt a change in the atmosphere. It was a horrifying déjà vu, a return from purity to filth. Moses carried the tablets in his hands, two heavy stones upon which the light of God's seal shone. This light was so bright that it could be seen even through the thick smoke of the cloud. He carried absolute perfection into the world of human impurity. First, they heard the sounds. Joshua, the warrior, first said, "The sound of war is in the camp." But Moses, who had just communed with eternity, found the truth in the sound. He knew that the sound of war is pain, but this sound was hollow, wild, indecent. It was a shout of pleasure that had turned into an orgy. The sound of trumpets, tambourines, and frantic singing distorted the sacred silence that should have reigned around the mountain. Then he saw it. As he broke through the last tents, a horrifying spectacle of betrayal unfolded before his eyes. In the center of the camp, where the tabernacle should have stood, was the golden calf, a primitive, heavy idol shining under the sun, reflecting the physical, material nature of their faith. People, undressed, plunged into a wild dance that was a direct repetition of the slave debauchery of Egypt. They were celebrating not liberation, but the rejection of freedom and a return to idolatry. This moment was devastating for Moses. The prophet's rage and despair equaled the faith that the people had yet to find. He felt not just disappointment, but a divine fury that coursed through his veins. The tablets in his hands suddenly became unbearably heavy, for they contained a covenant that had been broken even before it reached the ground. He lifted the tablets high above his head, and this was the final prophetic act of symbolism. He hurled them to the ground, and the stone cracked into two pieces with such a roar that it drowned out the cries of the crowd. This sound was louder than all the thunders of Sinai, for it was the sound of the ruptured covenant. The shattered fragments of stone, scattered into 1,000 pieces, became a physical reflection of God's broken heart and Moses' shattered hope. Smoke and fire filled the air from the fractured stone, and the fire Moses immediately kindled to destroy the idol. He burned the calf, ground it into fine black ashes, and forced the people to drink this bitter mixture of their sins. "Drink your sin!" he cried, his voice harsh as the desert rock, Moses' heart screamed in pain, realizing that these people, freed from slavery, had become slaves to their own lust. He now had to become not just a leader, but the executor of inevitable, bloody justice. Chapter 6. The restoration of the commandments, humility, and the renewed covenant. When the bloody cleansing of the camp was complete, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the camp. Moses was exhausted, but not broken. He understood that the act of wrath could not be the final word. The final word had to be mercy and restoration. God called Moses again, but this time the circumstances were different. The Lord commanded Moses to carve out new stone tablets himself, just like the first ones. This was an act of humility and cooperation. Moses had to put his own labor, his own repentance into creating the foundation for the new covenant. He approached the sacred summit with 2 rough, unworked blocks of stone, symbolizing the unworked heart of the people, ready to receive the word. He ascended Mount Sinai again and again, spent 40 days and 40 nights there, without food or water. But this ascent was different. It was not ecstasy, but atonement and reconciliation. He stood before God, pleading with him, begging him not to destroy the people who had sinned so quickly. He recalled all the attributes of God's glory that he had heard when he was in the cleft of the rock. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. This was his plea for a reprieve from wrath. And the Lord listened. This time the stone was whole, and the words of the Lord were carved again, but with a different power. They were stronger and brighter, for now they contained not just the law, but the experience of forgiveness. They were written on stone that Moses himself had hewed, symbolizing human participation in their salvation. Moses felt the faith and courage of his people grow with every line on the tablets. He knew that this new covenant, this new hope, was consecrated not only by the power of God, but also by his unwavering mercy. It was a covenant that endured betrayal and was restored through the tears and repentance of its leader. It was a demonstration that God does not abandon his people, even when they fall deeply. Moses did not just receive the law, he received the promise of God's constant presence in their lives. Chapter 7. The conclusion. The radiance of presence and the veil. When Moses descended from the mountain a second time, the sun was rising over the sands of Sinai, illuminating the people. But this was a completely different light. It merged with a strange, unearthly radiance that emanated from the prophet himself. His face shone. This phenomenon was so intense that it was later described as horned radiance, or Karen or rays of light. This was not a human glow of joy. It was the imprint of the divine glory that remained on him after his closeness to the Creator. Moses himself was unaware of this, but when he approached the camp, the Israelites looked upon him with awe and terror. They saw not their leader, but a living, walking proof that he had truly been in the presence of God. They could not look at him without fear, for the radiance was too intense for their sinful, imperfect eyes. It was a physical reminder that the sacred is dangerous. Aaron, his brother, was the first to realize what had happened. He approached Moses, but stepped back, struck by this shining aura. Moses, realizing that his appearance frightened those to whom he brought the covenant, took a veil and placed it over his face. He held the tablets firmly in his hands, feeling that every stone carried a promise, wisdom, and law given by God. The veil became a new psychological covenant between the prophet and his people. Moses only removed it when communing with God or when speaking to the people to deliver the new commandments. The Israelites looked upon the prophet with awe and hope, for they knew, through these commandments, through this new hard-won mercy, they would be able to walk the path of righteousness and light, even in the darkest of times. The radiance of Moses beneath the veil was a constant reminder of the inviolability of the renewed covenant, and that the price of sin is high, but God's mercy is boundless and shining.